Good morning, dear friends. Chodesh Tov. It is the first day of Rosh Chodesh, Tammuz, June 29th. Lamed Tammuz, the first day of Rosh Chodesh. And we're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Mesechet Shabbat, the 17th chapter, Parakol HaKelim. And we're on page 123b. 123b, that's where we're at. Of course, we dedicate our learning to the dear members of our Chabura and their households who attend or put up with devotion, dedication, and contribute great wisdom and insight as we make our way through the Talmud. And it's always a privilege to be able to learn and hear from everyone. I hope we'll continue to experience and gain from everyone's insight. As I mentioned before I hit record, we are probing the development, the evolution of muktzah. We're in the process going to uncover a number of important terminologies and some subcategories of muktzah. And let's leave it at that. I'll share the screen and we'll pull it up. Well, actually, I got logged out. The Mishnah mentions a statement of Rabbi Yossi, Kol HaKelim HaNitolim B'Shabbos. All kelim are nitolim b'Shabbos. All kelim may be used on Shabbos, with the two exceptions. What did he mean? You can use all kelim. So he means ostensibly. Well, we'll see. We'll see what he means. But ostensibly means in the scenarios where we said that even a kli, or even a keli that is prohibited, may be used. All right. So, and then we went over briefly the fact that there are certain kelim that are muktzah, machmas, chesron, kiss. They are delicate or precise or need to be in a pristine condition. They can only be used for their professional function, and therefore, otherwise they are muktzah. And we actually looked in the Shulchan Aruch yesterday, and we noticed that it includes a shochet's knife, a mohel's knife, a leather expert, and other types of highly specialized industry where there's a precise kind of blade or tool which would be damaged if it was used otherwise, and the craftsman has a set place where it's put. They don't let anybody touch it, and so because they're always constantly very careful about handling of that item, therefore it is considered muktzah as well. That was really what we discussed yesterday, but I just wanted, for the fullness of the record, I wanted to review that as well. Someone wanted to say something before we jump into the next.
So you're saying a moel's knife is muktzah?
Yes.
But you could do a bris on Shabbos.
A moel could do a bris, but we shouldn't be playing with the mohel's knife otherwise. I'm sorry, hold on. Oh, there we go. As a matter of fact, you know, I'm in touch with many young Jewish people that are either, you know, very culturally Jewish, maybe not fully observant, and many times they interact, like everyone in planet Earth, with people that are not Jewish. And, you know, when the boss and most of the workers are Jewish, varying inside jokes tend to develop. And so I was speaking to somebody recently who he and his other, the two owners are Jewish, and they have a very dear friend who works with them that's not. And they have this large shears in their office. And when the guy first came to work, they asked him why he has this very large tool. And they said, oh, it's because if any Gentiles work for us and they ask us to convert them, so we'll do the bris milah. And of course they were kidding, and he understood that. And because of that, they keep it now like on a pedestal. So suffice it to say, a moel has a highly special, hopefully sterile, hopefully well sharpened and precisely designed knife for his purpose. And a Moel, among others, would be very anxious and careful to not allow folks to use it for other purposes. And I think anyone that has a child, grandchild, or themselves had to undergo a circumcision, we certainly be relieved at least to know that the Mohel will hopefully be very meticulous with his the tools of his.
Rabbi,
Yes.
so we often have a case, especially in Montreal in the winter, where the Moil walks on Shabbos so that he can do the bris. So he would leave his knife in the shul or wherever before Shabbos and not carry anything, or he could even carry that.
Eruv. No. So let me clarify. All we said is, well, yeah. So for to do a bris, you're allowed to do. There are a variety of overrides on Shabbos law. So Moel is allowed to do the circumcision.
No, that's not my question. Does he have a problem with walking to wherever he's going to do the bris?
Is there an Eruv? No.
With the knife on him?
If there's an Eruv, then he should bring it beforehand. If there is not an Eruv, I'm sorry. If there's an Eruv, he would carry it. If there's no Eruv, he would leave it beforehand. We've had bris in here in our shul on Shabbos. Not many, but we've had. And the Mohel walked in from Aventura at a time where the Eruv was tenuous or not certain or whatever, or not continuous, and he left his supplies over here. I guess he trusted me that I wasn't.
Yeah, to be sure. Okay.
He trusted me that we weren't going to use his Mohel knife to cut the cake.
Rabbi,
yes.
I wonder whether the same approach could be used for a shofar that is not allowed to be carried on high holidays.
That's Shabbos.
Not necessarily
why we don't blow shofar on Shabbos.
You're referring to on Shabbos, right?
Right.
Yes. So indeed, we would not use on Shabbos. There is a gzeira of Rabbah not to blow shofar on Shabbos for that very reason, unless we come to carry it. But as far as the Mohel,
but the Eruv doesn't change the situation.
That's an interesting question, or it's an interesting point. Yes,
it's analogy. I'm thinking about analogy with.
I'll tell you the difference.
Mohel's knife.
I'll tell you the difference. At least, and again, it's a very good question. The difference, I believe, is that shofar. All you need to do is know how to blow the shofar, but you might have a question about your shofar, and the concern is that you'll bring it to an expert to ask a question on Shabbos. That's actually the explanation given. The Mohel is the expert in his field. That doesn't mean a Mohel will never have any questions, but I think it's a much more specialized, trained, hopefully, position, and so maybe there are less concerns. But it's an interesting question. It's worthy. I don't think now is the moment, but it is something interesting to consider. It's interesting to consider how we are comfortable eliminating the blowing of the shofar in Shabbat, but we're not comfortable to eliminate the bris. The question is not why that we shouldn't do the bris. The question is more, it helps us appreciate the sacrifice, if you will, of choosing to dial down or to cancel the sounding of the shofar. Anyways, let's take a look. Now we're going to see the source in the Tosefta. We read it yesterday. I'm going to go through it fast. I just want us to visualize, because we're going to be analyzing this text as we discuss the evolution of the laws of Muksa. Initially, at a certain point, as Rashi points out, in the time of Nehemiah ben Chachilai, Nehemiah, of course, the prophet at the time or leader in the beginning of the Second Temple era, as Rashi points out, we'll see. So then they said you can only carry 3 specific kalim: a knife, a spoon, and another kind of knife. And we saw Tosfos says, of course, silverware, or not silverware, cups, bowls. Food was never considered muksa, but as far as kalim are concerned, there were only 3 at a certain time that were not muksa. Everything else was off the table. Sounds extreme, but we'll probe this a little further. Hitiru, at a certain point, they became more lenient and they permitted additional muksa items, or they demuxified additional items. The chazro v'hitiru, and then there was another phase where additional kalim were taken off of the muksa list and they were permitted to be used. V'chazru v'itiru, and a third time, they extended additional permissibility, additional leniencies in the realm of using kelim on Shabbos, Acha Amru, till the point where the following was stated. Kol HaKelim, this is the statement that we saw in the Mishnah of Rabbi Yossi. It says, Kol HaKelim, Nitalim b'Shabbat, all kelim can be carried on Shabbos, Chutz min Masar Gadol, a large saw, the Yaseh Shel Macharesha, and the plow piece, whatever you call that.
Blade.
Plow blade. Now, there is considerable background noise. I don't know where it's from, so I'm just going to hit mute all, but I'm going to ask everyone to unmute for questions, comments. Okay. Here we go. Rashi, Hitiru, Od. There was additional leniency. Kisharao shechazru lihizaher kitzat. When they saw that people, because long story short, as Rashi points out, and the Gemara is going to say in a moment, the Jewish people in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash had a variety of moral or spiritual or Torah shortcomings. It's hard to blame them. They went through an exile, and communication was not as easy. The printing press didn't exist. So there are many reasons why we don't understand how it would be harder for people to maintain a rigid Jewish identity. Plus, of course, in the first temple era and even in the second temple era, a lot of Yiddishkeit was temple centric and Eretz Yisrael centric. And so it seems like there was a lot of people that lost or had compromised Jewish identities. And so a number of the original efforts taken by the founding fathers, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, Ezra and Nehemiah, were to create takanot, a variety of enactments to help the Jewish people rediscover and strongly embrace their Jewish identity. And so, in the realm of Shabbos, people were being very lax on Shabbos, as we'll see in a moment, and so they created a lot of restrictions. But then, Hitiru, this is Rashi. When they saw that people were starting to be more mindful of Shabbos, they were more lenient. So basically, people were not doing Shabbos very well at all. And so the rabbis chose to, if you will, clamp down and create very, very rigid and inflexible regulations about Shabbos. Now, in a moment, we could discuss if this is how we would choose to function if we noticed that Shabbos observance was weak. But I don't want to go there yet because it's an interesting academic question. But the purpose of that conversation would be to understand and understand the circumstances then. But it is an interesting question. I think we could ask ourselves, but let's just hold it off till the end of this Gemara. We'll understand exactly what the different benchmarks were, why the rabbis became more and more flexible about Muksa. So basically, at one point they shut down. They basically declared every keli is muksa, with three very specific exceptions. And at the end of the process, they came back almost to the original place where almost everything under the right circumstances could be handled, could be carried, with two big exceptions. That is the somewhat vague text over here from the Tosefta. The Gemara is going to give us more information, some of which we've filled in from Rashi and in my introduction, but some we have yet to uncover. Any thoughts or comments? Just to throw back at you, I want to hear thoughts and comments now. There's a good chance whatever the thoughts will be addressed, at least in part, in the coming lines. Doctor?
Regarding the being a little more careful about keeping Shabbos, I recently read a small little anecdote that the Rabbanim say when Jews in Poland, in Galicia and Lithuania were not very careful as far as the intricacies of Shabbos, the Jews in Paris are actually completely mechalel Shabbos. So it depends on how, when an area usually more strict than the other one also.
You're saying that laxity, a small laxity in an intense place, let's say like Lithuania, could trickle down to, I've heard a similar anecdote, maybe that's what you're referring to. They had a guy who would sit for 20 hours in a cloise in Vilna learning. And someone said, no, why don't you take another 15-minute break? He said, yeah, I'll take a 15-minute break. And the guy who sits next to me, who only studies 18 hours a day, is going to take a break. And then, and then the guy who only comes to say Tehillim in the morning will cut out some of his Tehillim. And before you know it, the guy, the Balagala is going to shmad. So, and there's actually a lot of truth. And again, we could discuss if it's good or bad or whatever, but there is a certain kind of social cohesion where we hold each other together and encourage observance. Dr. Hammer.
I probably missed this in my absence in Israel, whatever, but what is in terms of muktzah, what is the overriding basis and principle for why there is such a thing as being unable to use or touch items on Shabbos?
So actually, before we started this chapter, we took a peek in the Rambam and then others who gave a few different, not always consistent, meaning there are different takes on the exact intention of muktzah. But it's a good reminder, and it also really is coming up out of our Gemara here. In a nutshell, who remembers what the Rambam said? Anybody remember what the Rambam said?
I mean, I can speculate that it has to do with the Lamed Tet Balachot, some of these Kalim. Okay.
Yes. So I'll try to remember the 3 points the Rambam says. Right. Number 1, which was in his number 3, some people don't work on Shabbos. I'm sorry, some people don't work during the week. They sit at home all day. And so we need to find a way to assist them in strongly feeling a distinction between Shabbos and the weekday. And so additional restrictions, which are not in the realm of the 39 malachis, gave them a framework to feel the distinction of Shabbos. That's the last thing he says. I would understand if we don't like that, but that's something that he says. The other point he makes, which I think is more in line, Dr. Hammer, with what you suggested, is that being that many of these kelim are utilized to do malacha, klisha malachta le'isr, well, therefore, if we allow people to handle the tools, invariably they'll end up using them for their prohibited use. And it's more than that, I think, psychologically. Muktzah creates a certain taboo around not even doing a malacha, but even handling the item that's used to create a malacha. And so psychologically, it creates an additional removal and an additional, it's like a gzera. It's a gzera that keeps us removed. So if you can't even touch it and you don't even touch it, there's an extra security, there's an extra line of security before a person ends up engaging in malacha. I'm going to leave those 2 points for now, but what it leaves yet to be understood is that only answers some of the types of muktzah. Muktzah machmas chesron kiss and muktzah machmas, whatever, we'll see, that doesn't exactly explain those degrees of muktzah. Rebero?
Rabbi, isn't there also, in making things more easily accessible, the idea of Oneg Shabbos on the positive side?
Well, that might explain why there was a desire from the Chachamim to ultimately give back,
right?
To expand what was permissible, because you don't want Shabbos to be too rigid or too restrictive. There's enough restrictions within the framework of the Lamed Tes Malachis, and so to say that you cannot handle anything really puts a person in an awkward position. But the final point, which is the point our Gemara is making, is somehow when Ezra and Nehemiah, the returning Jews, returned back to Israel, the Second Temple, after many years in Bavel, and people were entirely disconnected from Shabbos observance. At that point, apparently the sense was the less options we create, the more rigid Shabbos observance looks. In a way, the easier it'll be for everyone to be either in or out. The more grays make it easier for a person to straddle being within Shabbos and out of Shabbos. Now, I understand, and this is what I was alluding to. that today, if we were to have a brainstorming session, how to encourage people to observe Shabbos more, I don't suppose putting an ad campaign saying all the things you cannot do and adding additional restrictions is going to gain us many converts or recruits to Team Shabbos. So today, probably a campaign to bring people back would start with a very slight exposure to Shabbos and probably an exposure to the more meaningful and less restrictive parts of Shabbos, which is indeed how people generally are afforded an opportunity to experience Shabbos. But at that time, I think we have to realize that until the modern age, community was everything. You needed to be, so people wanted to be a part of this fledgling experiment, if you will, the reconstruction of Jerusalem. People wanted to be a part of it. There were probably also certain, access to certain rights and protections and the like. And so over there, people wanted to be or needed to be part of the community. So they're probably the more simple the rules of Shabbos were. You can't touch anything, with 3 exceptions. It made it in a way simpler for people to be in line with Shabbos observance, and maybe it created a framework that brought everybody on board, and then they were slowly eased out. But let's see the text, let's see how it's conveyed, and maybe I didn't convey it properly, and I would love to hear from you as we read the coming lines of the Gemara. We'll hopefully gain some additional insight to this process. So again, I know let's see. My hitiru v'chazru v'hitiru. What does it mean that there was permission and then more permission and more permission? There was a gradual unfurling or they held the line and they slowly gave more and more. What does it mean? Amar Abaye explains. Hitiru davar shemalachtai leheter l'tzayrich gufay. Initially, the first wave, the first step of reintroduced permission, and I should say this reminds me of how some of the diets work. A lot of the diet programs, the way they work is the person wants to lose weight. The doctor tells them you have to lose weight or whatever. So the first step, initially, maybe they ease you into it, but at a certain point, there's an extremely regulated and restrictive diet that a person has to maintain. And then with time, as they achieve success with the diet, slowly some items are reintroduced back into the person's diet. So it sounds almost like that kind of strategy. So the first heter was hitiru davar shemalachtai leheter. They allowed folks to handle a tool or an object which its use is okay on Shabbos. L'tzayrich gufay, for the very function. So give me an example of a kli shemalachtai leheter. Anyone? Help me out. What's a kli shemalachtai leheter? What is an object that its function is for a permitted use? Anything?
Spoon.
A spoon.
I'm sorry?
A spoon.
So the only reason why I don't want to say spoon is because spoon was on that original waiver list that was never taken off the table, or not fully taken off the table.
Yeah, but it was a combination of a spoon and a fork.
Right. Okay. So let's say spoon for our purposes. Entirely permissible. You're allowed to use a spoon. It's not a malacha. On the contrary, you could use it for its function. For a constructive function. To us, that's like, whoa, that you needed a license to handle something that's not a malacha, to do that permitted act. But yeah, because they were slowly being eased back into it. Rashi, hitiru litaltel davar sheikar melachto b'chol leheter ledavar mutar b'shabbat. Initially, they said you can carry an item who its use commonly during the weekday is allowed to be done on Shabbos too. It's not a malacha. Ledavar hamotar b'Shabbos, and for that very function on Shabbos. So ledavar hamotar b'Shabbos hitiru l'taltel l'tzarech gufa. If they needed it to do its use, you could carry it. But you could not pick it up and move it because you needed its place. That was the very first step. That was the very first license, according to Abaye. Then what did they permit further? Davar, shemalachte leheter, the very same tool, the very same kli, the very same object whose use is permissible. They could now carry it litzarich mekaymai, even if you just needed it. So let's say an ice cream scooper. Maybe that wasn't included in the original waiver. Let's say, but you're allowed to scoop ice cream on Shabbos. Although if we mix our diet analogy with our Shabbos analogy, maybe not. So initially we said you could use the ice cream scooper to scoop ice cream. And then we said, you know what if the ice cream scoop is on a seat and you want to sit there? So you want to move the ice cream scoop to sit there. Originally you were not allowed to, but then the Chazar V'Tiro, you could move it so that you could have its space. Rashi, Chazar V'Tiro, es elo l'tzarich mekaymai, to be able to use its place. So you could move it, replace it, put it somewhere else. Then Chazar V'Tiro davar shemalachte le'isur. Then they said, you know what? You can even use a hammer. A hammer is a davar shemalachte le'isur. Typically, banging in nails or whatever else you do with a hammer, for the most part, is prohibited on Shabbos. But they said, you know what? You can even carry a davar shemalachte le'isur, l'tzarich gufay, but for a permissible use. L'tzarich gufay, in l'tzarich mekaymai. So then they said you could use a hammer to crush nuts or whatever else, but not to, obviously not l'tzarich mekaymai. But you still were not allowed to move it because it was in your way and you needed to have the chair, let's say. And the adayin b'yadei achas in b'shtei yadav lei. At that point, they also said, you know what? You can move any keli shemalachte le'isur. It's prohibited for its use, but only if you can wield it with one hand. So there were a number of restrictions for a kli shemalachte le'isur. Ad she'amru, until a certain point, at the end of this process, they said, you know what? Kol ha'kelim nitalim b'Shabbos afilu b'shtei yadayim. You're allowed to handle all kelim for permissible use, even with two hands. This two-hand thing is interesting. We haven't encountered it yet, or at least not in a comprehensive way, but that's one of the theories, because remember, what the Chachamim were keen on doing was creating some restriction beyond the 39 malachas to help people remember that it's Shabbos and to help somewhat restrict the person's behavior to be Shabbostic. So to lift a heavy tool, which is usually permitted with two hands, it means your entire being is enveloped by it. And so it's easier to lose, I imagine, this is just me thinking out loud, it's easier to find that a person loses themselves if they have to lift a very heavy kli, they're using all their might, they start schwitzing maybe.
Rabbi.
And so initially it was prohibited. Yes, Rabbi Barrow.
Maybe they say with two hands here, but in the sense that one hand would be using it in an irregular way, which was one of the escapes.
Well, yeah, I mean, but two hands is not inherently a problem on Shabbos.
No, but I think the point being that something that you would carry to make it legal and Shabbos, you would do it with one hand instead of two and say this is an irregular way of whatever we said before, back a couple of pages.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, let's. Oh, there's one last Rashi we got to read. Okay. Who's saying this? Abaye is saying this. So Abaye is elaborating on this text. There's 3 or 4 phases, and Abaye is giving us his take on it. First, they said you could use a permissible thing to do a permissible act. Then they said you can carry a permissible a kli shemalachte leheter, even just because you need a space. Then they said, you know what? You can even carry a davar shemalachte leisur for a permissible use. And then they said you can carry any keli, even with 2 hands, so long as you're doing a Shabbos use. Let's read this Rashi. When we said that you can carry any tool with the exception of that heavy saw, Deloy Shari, You cannot carry it even for permitted use, even to move it. This is the explanation of Abaye. The Abaye de Mitara Tachi, Abaye who explains the evolution of muksa in this manner. Clearly, Hadar Bey Legabe Rava, he is retracting from a debate that he had with Rabbah earlier on. Rabbah said, "The Amar Le'el Kornas Shal Nefachim Shanino." Abaye is the one who says that when the Mishnah says Kornas, what kind of hammer? We said it was a hammer that's. Hold on, I'm sorry. Yeah. Abaye here is changing the mind. Originally, he said you can crack nuts with a nut cracking hammer, but not with a blacksmith's hammer. Abaye is originally the one who argued with Rabbah and says you may not use in the Mishnah a kli shemalachta le'isur. You cannot use a tool which has a prohibited function. Now, says Rashi, Abaye is easing up. Abaye is now striking a more permissive tone. Abaye is now agreeing or conceding to Rabbah that when the Mishnah says you're allowed to handle a kli, a tool, he means you're allowed to handle a tool which its primary function is prohibited so long as you're using a permissible use. So if this Rashi confuses you, disregard it. My point here, however, is that we find Abaye here, apparently, according to Rashi, conceding to Rabbah and expanding the license to wield a tool, even if it's primarily does Shabbos-ly prohibited use, you're allowed to do permitted use. So again, in our classic example, you can take a hammer, even if the hammer is usually used by a blacksmith or usually used on a construction site. Abaye says, you know what? You can use that hammer to crack nuts or any other Shabbos-ly permitted use. On the topic of two hands and one hand, the Chassam Sofer weighs in and says, Mishum, the stam soirich gufay shal kli b'Shabbos hu b'yadai echad. The average act that is allowed to be done on Shabbos is typically with one hand. It is not common that you'll find one will find themselves using a tool in a very heavy manner on Shabbos. And so it actually makes sense to have a restriction on the weight. In Amar Adayim b'yadei echad in anyways, the Chassam Sofer says we'll see another way to interpret this text where he eliminates the one hand and two hand issue. He has a different way to determine it. But according to Abaye, the reason why we distinguish between one hand and two hands makes sense. It makes sense that a person should not be encouraged or would typically not do something that's super heavy on Shabbos. And let's think about it. All of the permissible uses, anything that you're allowed to do on Shabbos, or not anything, but most things are going to be not with two hands. Now, I'm thinking of a very important instance that you'll tell me, Rabbi, I'm thinking of a very good example of which you do need two hands. And I'm thinking about rolling a Torah, for example, which is heavy and a two-handed thing. But a Torah is not a kli, and a Torah was clearly never made muksa, just like food was not made muksa. But think about most of the things that you're allowed to do on Shabbos, and you'll have a hard time. I'm not saying you won't be able to, but you'll have a hard time coming up with a task that needs two hands.
Rabbi, I just thought of something.
Go ahead.
For hygiene purposes, were you allowed to carry a handkerchief?
Yeah, I believe so. Certainly if you're in your home, if you're not going in out of an Eruv.
Even if you're going out of an Eruv?
No, not. Unless you're wearing it in a way that's considered permissible on Shabbos. But typically one would not carry a kerchief. Although you're asking an interesting question, so I'm not giving you a halachic opinion. It's a little bit off of the very specific topic here. Because remember, here we're talking about muksa. Muksa. Meaning now we're not talking about carrying outside of an Eruv, we're talking about handling something that for whatever reason we're not allowed to handle on Shabbos. This was Abaye's explanation. Rava is going to, and this is something we could come to kind of expect from Rava. Rava and Abaya very frequently are highlighted in the areas that they disagree about the interpretation of the teachings that were handed down to them. So again, this is not a surprise. This is something we kind of look forward to. As a matter of fact, in some literature, the Talmud is referred to, or the form of the Talmud is called the Havayas of Abaya and Rava, the different present proposals of Abaya and Rava. So one of the hallmarks of the debate in the Talmud is Abaya and Rava, and indeed, this will be no exception. Amar lei Rava. Rava responds, retorts, pushes back to Abaya. Mechdi. Let's read carefully the text of the Tosafta that we're analyzing. Hitiru ketani. The words used are hitiru. They permitted. Sounding like they were talking about an item, not an activity. Mali l'tzarech gufay. Mali l'tzarech mekayme. Why do you differentiate between different uses of a single item? Rava has a different interpretation. Itiru, the first permission was, the first license was Dovar, something that can be used, that is typically done on, that is allowed to be used on Shabbos. You could carry it for its immediate use, or because you need to move it because you need its place. Okay, maybe I explained this to you not imprecisely. Professor, you agree that I explained this imprecisely? His challenge here is not an item versus a license. His challenge, I'm looking at Rashi here, is the word hitiru. I think what Rashi's saying is it's likely that they gave all of the commonly, reasonably allowed uses. Rashi, l'tzorech hitiru b'pam rishona. Mali gufay, mali mekoymai, tarvayu tzorech ninu. They permitted it for a use, for a need. Why are we distinguishing between needing the item and needing the space of the item? So again, I'm revising my explanation based on Rashi to re-explain the Gemara. Rava's challenge to Abaya is the word hitiru means they permitted a need. We shouldn't differentiate between different kinds of needs, whether you need it to use it. Yes?
I think it's easy to distinguish. That is obviously the moving the object to use its place, or because it is on the way for other, it interferes with other permissible activities, is less a violation of Shabbos than picking up the object and with the intention of do something with the object. That is, it's less infraction in the spirit of Shabbos. That is, it's not necessarily so, but if there is a distinction, then I would explain this distinction with a degree of interference.
So Rava is looking at the language. He's trying to give a basic, he's trying to infer from there what it would likely include. And he's not keen, Rava's not keen to divide using it permissibly and needing its space. He says both of those are immediate needs. So when we say the word hitiru, we gave a license. We gave a license for the things that were needed. Why would I distinguish between using it or needing its place? And that's how Rava explains. And again, that's based on my reading Rashi, not just guessing or inferring how I would read it. Elama Rava. Rava says, you know what the development, you know what the evolution was? Step number one. After they said shut down, you can't carry anything. When they started easing the restrictions, the first thing they said is, if it's not muksa, let's go to our ice cream scooper. If it's the ice cream scooper, you can use it. It can be used both to scoop ice cream, and it can also be used because it's in your way. Then they added an additional license. Hold on. At a later point, they said, you know what? You can even move something into the shade. Moving something into the shade as Rashi explains, is not an immediate function. It's not an immediate need. It doesn't serve you now. You're not using it, and it's not making a space available. Rashi explains, he doesn't need the item at all. Not for its use, not for its place. He's afraid that maybe it'll become damaged. If you leave something in the sun for a very long time, it might start fading, it might start cracking, but it's not an urgent and immediate use. And yet, the Chachamim expanded their license. They expanded what is permitted to handle. You can carry a kli, shemalachta leheter. That ice cream scooper can be moved no matter the need, for a use, for its place, or even just to preserve it down the road. That was step number 2. The Chazar V'Tira, step number 3 was davar shemalachta le'isur. You're allowed to even carry a hammer or any other tool which typically does melacha. When could you carry it? To do something permitted like cracking nuts, or to get that hammer off of your seat. That was permitted. But they still were not going to allow you to move a muksa item that it has a prohibited function simply to get it out of the shade. And vadayin ba'adam echad in shnei bnei adam loy, the license to carry a tool that's melachta le'isur was restricted to one person carrying it, not 2. 2 people carrying a heavy piece of equipment conjures a construction site, hardcore melacha, and so that was still not permitted. Ad sha'amru, until they granted the big blanket license, which says as follows: Kol ha'kelim nitolim b'Shabbos. All implements, all tools can be carried on Shabbos. Afilu b'shnei b'nei adam, even 2 people carrying it together. Of course, not to do a malacha, but they can carry it to use it for a permitted use. They can carry it because it needs to be moved out of the way. They could even carry it to protect it from damage, so long, of course, that they're not doing a malacha. Rashi. Hainu oid heter achrina. This represents an additional license, an additional easing. Kol ha'kelim, afilu gedolim, even large tools. Umil lichadokimna shel heter, afilu melchama letzel v'shel isur l'tzargov mekam. Ultimately, the story is going to be, if it's permissible, you can even move it into the shade. But if it's a isur, then you can commonly move it for its use, for its place. So the Gemara is not totally done this process. So I want to just give you a recap, a fast recap. We have a Tosefta that describes a development where initially the rabbi said everything is muksa. And then there was a gradual easing up, a gradual permitting of handling different tools. Abaye and Rava argue. Abaye says the phases were first only for use, then even just to move it from its place. Then they said you can even use a tool which is typically prohibited, but then only for its common function, not for its place. And in the end, he said you can even move it for its place, and you can even use it with 2 hands.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I didn't want to go off on a tangent, but since you mentioned an ice cream scoop, I just saw a bulletin that Ben & Jerry's caved in on Israel. They will allow the guy to do whatever he does and sell it wherever he wants.
Oh, wow. That's big.
You gave me the segue.
I'm sorry. I'm guilty as charged. Now, I the second time in one day, I want to correct myself. I believe this. I don't think we ever gave a license for a davar shemalachta le'isur. We didn't ever say you're allowed to move a hammer inside because of shade. We said you can move a tool that's prohibited for use, for its place, and even if it is super heavy. But I do not believe we ever gave a license michama l'tzel for a davar that's a prohibited item. But we need to see the rest of the Gemara to have clarity, but I just wanted to put that up that it's not at all certain. Esvei Abaya. Abaya challenges Rava. Abaya is the one who gave who is the first one who explained the text. He challenges now Rava. So Rava challenged Abaya, presented his own opinion, and now Abaya is going to push back. Esvei Abaya. Here is Abaya's challenge. Midoicha, we said that a mortar, which is used alongside a pestle, right? Remember that discussion?
Yes.
If it has garlic inside it, it has food inside it. Metaltal and oisa, you can carry it. Bimlav ain't metaltal and oisa, but if it does not have food in it, it is muksa. What's the problem? Problem is, Rava says the license is absolute; it's for everything. Rashi. Bishlemo the ain't metaltal and oisa l'tzarech mekayma kamar. Hold on. Let me see something. Yeah. Abaya says you can move something. Okay, that's really where my correction was. I'm sorry to confuse you. Abaya, who's the original stab at the text, says a klisha malachti le'isur can be carried for use, but not for its place. I explained this Gemara incorrectly. This is not my third correction. This is the spin-off of the same original previous correction. He says you can move a davar shemalachti le'isur to use it, but not for its location, not for its place. Rava disagrees and says you can move it for its place, but not michamol itself. That was where I got it wrong. Now, looking at the challenge, and if you're confused, I apologize. We have a scenario of a tool that is malachta le'isur, and we said ein metaltal and oisa may not be carried. Rashi says, what Abai is saying is, according to me, ein metaltal and oisa l'tzarech mekayma cannot be moved just because you need its place. What kind of prohibited movement? Why are you not allowed to handle it? So the Gemara answers, Rava will answer, what does it mean? You're not allowed to carry it. You're not allowed to transport it just for its upkeep or preservation. And that's why we can't carry it. But if you had an actual use for it, or if you needed mekayma, you'd be allowed to use it. Esvei. Now we have a challenge. Esvei. The text continues and says, V'shavin shem kitziv al basar she'asur l'tataloi. The text continues and says, everybody agrees that if it was already used for meat, you cannot carry it. Yeah, we also mean over here, you could use it if you needed to use it. You could move it if you need its place. The prohibition of this text is everybody agrees you cannot move it just to get it out of the sun. This concludes our discussion, our debate between Abai and Rava about the development, the evolution of muksa. They all agree that there was a gradual easing up of the restrictions. There was the nuanced difference between the process. There's a distinction. The main nafkamina, the main halachic difference between Abaya and Rava at this point is Abaya says a hammer can only be used to break nuts. You may not move the hammer just to have your seat available. That's Abaya. Rava disagrees and says no. A hammer, a drill, a jackhammer. If you could figure out a permissible use that does not desecrate Shabbos, you can carry it. Or if it's in your place and you need to move it, you can also carry it. This is Rava's opinion. But you cannot move it just because you're afraid it might get damaged by the sun. That's the big nafkamina. That is the big halachic distinction between Rava and Abaya. What would be about moving a muksa item or a thing that its use is prohibited? for its place. Abaye says no. Rava says yes. Now I want to point out that all the comment, the halachic works clarify. This doesn't mean that there is no prohibition to handle a hammer. The default setting on a hammer is don't handle it. So for example, what does that mean? So for example, if you have a nutcracker that's permissive, you cannot take a hammer. But if you don't have a nutcracker, then you can easily take the hammer to break the nuts. Once you've done whatever you need to do with the hammer, it should once again not be handled. So it still can be called muksa, but there are a number of licenses. There are a number of heterim, of instances where it can be used. And so we don't need to revise our Shabbos lexicon. We don't need to cease referring to items that are melachta le'isser, but maybe it has a function on Shabbos. We can yet call them muksa. So Dr. Hammer, I'm sorry, or maybe you're relieved to know you don't need to reclassify your name. Hammers are still muksa, but for constructive uses, we can yet use a hammer on Shabbos. You're muted, so we don't hear you, but.
So could you use a pair of pliers if you don't have the hammer to crack
For
the
what
nut?
purpose?
To crack the nut.
I suppose so. Doctor?
I will be known as the heter hammer on Shabbos.
Heter hammer. Oh. Amar Rabbi Chanina, this is along the same subject, to understand the evolution of muksa. So Dr. Hammer, you asked a question in the beginning of the class. This will hopefully give us some additional insight. Rabbi Chanina explains. Bimei Nechemya ben Chacheloi, Nishnis Mishnazu. This Mishnah describes the events that occurred in the times of Nehemiah. Here is a verse that describes reality in Israel in the time of Nehemiah. By Yomim Ahema, in those days, where Isi Yehuda, I noticed in Judea, Dorchim Gitais B'Shabbos, they were making wine. Umevim Ha'aremais, and they were transporting heaps of grain. And Rabbi Steinsaltz is kind and provides us the full pasuk. In those days, I saw in Judea some treading wine presses, bringing heaps of grain, lading donkeys with them, also wine, grapes, figs, all manner of burden which are brought into Jerusalem on the Shabbos day. I forewarned them on that day when they sold food. So Nehemiah enters Jerusalem and notices a terrible lack of Shabbos observance, a grave breakdown of the Shabbos sanctity. Rashi, Mishnah Zu D'Le'el, the text that describes the development, the initial restriction of Gimel Kalim Sulai, they had utter disdain or lack of conformity to the laws of Shabbos. Rabbi Steinsaltz explains, since the people disdained the sanctity of Shabbos, or they treated the sanctity of Shabbos with disdain, Nehemiah instituted many stringencies with regards to all the halachas of Shabbos in order to educate the people to observe Shabbos. What do they say? What's the doctor would say? Do no harm. So the first thing is that guys, stop everything. We're going to shut this down until we figure out how to get Shabbos back on track. So the first thing is freeze. Everybody froze. They stopped doing everything. And now slowly they're able to build up and create a nuanced and educated populace that knows how to observe Shabbos. The first thing Nehemiah did is told everyone to freeze. Before we continue, the Chassam Sofer once again is going to make a very important note here. Ayin Bava Kama Tzadik Daled Amid Beis in Tosfos over there, which from there we can infer Mashma de Nehemiah Rak L'Doirei Tikin. It's clear that Nehemiah made some enactments that were only intended to be to the folks of his age. If that's the case, then this whole development would have occurred in the days of Nehemiah. So it's possible, says the Chassam Sofer, that Nehemiah himself led the people through a rapid series of leniencies, which is consistent with the explanation that I gave and Rabbi Steinsaltz gave, where he kind of said, everyone got to shut this down, everyone freeze, you can't do anything on Shabbos, and then slowly he built up and explained to them what Shabbos looks like. Anyways, He
Rabbi,
challenges that.
do-
It's
do we
likely that this
know-
was, hold on. It's likely that this was over several generations. But likely what happened is Nehemiah, when he made the original restrictions, they were intended to be rolled back. The reason why this is important to point out is because there's a rule that says that a Sanhedrin, a Beis Din that makes a Gzera, no future Sanhedrin can roll it back unless they are Gedolim b'minyan ubechachma. They either have a larger assembly or are a higher caliber of wisdom. And it's going to be hard to claim that future generations had higher star power than the Anshe Knesset Agdola at the beginning of this Bayesheni, where you had Ezra, Nehemiah, Mordechai. It was really an all-star cast of Chachamim. So we must conclude that either Nehemiah and his Sanhedrin themselves did the easing, or at the very least, we'd have to conclude that Nehemiah wired it from the outset to be eased over time. So that's what the Chassam Sofer, I think, is getting at over there, and others as well.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do we know how successful his method was?
The Jews observe Shabbos today, so there must have been some. Well, actually, I'll tell you a different answer. That was a cheap answer.
So you're
No,
telling
no,
me
I want to give you
it
an
took
honest
until today. It took until today. So
The
that's
honest answer is clearly it was successful because it was rolled back. It was rolled back in acknowledgement of the successful reintegration and the reacceptance of Shabbos. So
The issue is, so in those days, the Jews at least listened to him. Today, anybody comes and says, stop everything, I don't think you're going to get much of a response to that.
yeah, I
I'm
mean,
not-
that was my comments when I said
I'm
that
not
today.
sure
if we
they
wanted
listened to him.
Today, if we wanted to encourage Shabbos observance, we would have to, oh, well, we're over time. We would have to give people a gradual exposure to Shabbos, not overwhelm them with prohibitions, and certainly not add on different prohibitions. But as my theory, or as I explained, that I think you'll probably agree with me, in those days, Ezra and Nehemiah, they were also Nehemiah was a political leader with clout with a king. So I think people needed to be in his good graces. And so he was able in his position as a part of the Sanhedrin, they were able to make restrictions and nobody wanted to be thrown out of the walls. We read the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. It was a dangerous place. It was the Wild West. And so you needed community. And so I think they were able to impose conformity, and it seems like people would have needed to go along. And most likely what happened here is this was the ignorance. This wasn't necessarily exclusively an intentional rejection, but people lost the tradition. You couldn't Google today. You want to know how to do a Shabbos, you want to know how to do a cholent, and you want to know how to have a plata, and you want to know how to, you just Google it. And although I'm not telling you to use Google as a halachic source, but there's a great proliferation of information. And a bunch of Jews can get together on Zoom every day, and we could study Gemara, and we could peek in the Mishnah Berurah, the Shulchan Aruch. In those days, they didn't have it, and it was a lot easier to lose details of the tradition. Now, I need to ask you a question. I'm intending to show in Shul, because tomorrow in Shul, it's Rosh Chodesh, and it's going to be a breakfast, and I'm going to allow them to stream Emmanuel's wedding, allow our community and person in the Shul allow them to feel part. So I can try to pull my computer away, but Shul is likely to be a little chaotic. So I'm wondering if we shouldn't just invite everybody to I'm not keen on doing this, but maybe we could either invite everybody to join the stream and God forbid not have the shir, or we'll have the shir with a caveat that it's going to be noisy and I may have to end early. What's our vote?
Depends. It depends if you want to follow Rava or you want to
All right,
follow
so here's what we're going
Abaya.
to do. We're going to try. We're going to start off at 10 o'clock. Please be forewarned that there's a chance that it'll be a considerably shorter shir than usual. That's what we'll do. So I don't want to,
Okay.
I've canceled enough because I needed to. I don't want to cancel a shir, but just if you don't mind, be mindful that we're probably not going to get through the hour and it'll be a little bit different than usual. So if you're willing to put up, Doctor, you're muted.
Is Bernie still on, Dr.
I'm still
Hammer?
on. I'm still on. Where's the wedding in Jerusalem? Where is it?
You know
For the
what?
Kotel.
I believe it's overlooking the Kotel. Oh,
It is overlooking. It's overlooking. It's a
Over-
rooftop over the Kotel. It's just up. You're in the plaza and you look up, it's just there. There's
I believe it's by the Kolel Chabad soup kitchen, which is overlooking
it's on the- it's on the
above
rooftop.
Esha Torah, or no, it's to the right of Esha Torah, I believe.
If you're back to the Kotel,
Right, if you're back at the Kotel, it's to the right of Esha Torah,
Right.
it's actually a little closer.
and so I think they're going to be doing it over there.
Yeah, there's a deck there with lots of chairs.
Yeah, so they have a
While we have Dr. Hammer on, the interesting thing that's going on also is if you have to break a habit, do you do it cold turkey or you don't? I mean,
Very
that's the
interesting.
basic issue in the background, no?
Well, I don't know. What I see, Rabbi, as a real problem is once you give heterim to get people, if you think of conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, people or families have been doing things for years, generations, whatever, to say that, and forget about why they were doing it. Everything else is looked upon as being very much more confining, and for what reason? In terms of Muktzah, in terms of Shabbos, why can't you do this and that? So it's a double-edged sword when you start going back and forth with being makil and being,
I hear you.
Yeah.
You're saying the text itself yeah. So this text really strongly embodies the interesting, conflicting, I guess, reality in halacha, which is that there is the hardcore, untouchable halacha, and then there is room for Chazal, the Chachamim, to add takanis. But then there's here what's unique is that the Chachamim actually do scale back their restriction, and it seems like it was only intended to be a temporary measure, but yet it is certainly confusing. And
This text stresses or exhibits or shows the coercive power that Nehemiah had at this time. That is, he had the power to force people to follow what he says. Remember, he started not with Shabbos, but with massive divorces, forcing people to abandon their non-Jewish wives.
Right.
Try to do that today.
So you're saying this is not even this is just a small facet of
Right.
many. Yes, that is
A
true.
demonstration of his power over the population.
Yeah.
but
All right.
Rabbi, cold turkey is not a good idea, period.
Cold turkey, what we say, easy come, easy go, right?
Yeah, I mean, could be
Anyway.
dangerous in many cases.
So obviously,
All
the
right.
12-step approach, which Rabbi Twersky keeps talking about in many